The ruling class. Elementi di Scienza Politica. Gaetano Mosca. Translation by Hannah D. Kahn. Edited and revised, with an introduction, by Arthur Livingston. 1896. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Chapter 11. Collectivism. 1. In beginning our examination of social democracy, it will perhaps be advisable to consider a bit of history. In a number of religious and social movements that have eventually acquired prominence, it is hard to determine the exact share that the first founder and his early associates had in the twists that those movements developed in practice. It is often not the easiest thing in the world to verify the birth certificates of the first masters and to tell just what traits were peculiar to them at the start. The personality of Shakyamuni is draped in the vagueness and uncertainty of Buddhist legend. Perhaps we shall never know just what part Manes, the founder of Manichaeism, played in beliefs, which later on, at the end of the 5th century AD, brought on an attempt at something like a social revolution in Persia. But when present-day socialism dawned, the world was living in a far riper intellectual period. The new doctrines, and personal recollections regarding them, were at once gathered into books, which were published in thousands of copies, and they were so well preserved for posterity that few of them probably will ever be destroyed or lost. The beginnings of the Reformed doctrines that are so widely current in our day are therefore well known and can be followed step by step. Going back to their not very distant origins, one can easily make sure that Voltaire and his followers, although they may have had an important part in destroying the old world, almost never referred to any new social system, or systems, that might replace the one they knew. The real parent of the sentiments, the passions, the manner of looking at social life and appraising it, that resulted practically in the birth and growth of social democracy, was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, above, Chapter 10, Section 4. It would of course be easy to find in China, in India, in the Persia of the Sassanids, in ancient Egypt, in a few Greek and Roman writers, in the prophets of Israel, in the reformers of Mohammedanism, in the early Christian fathers and in the heresiarchs of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era, ideas, sentiments, scattered opinions and sometimes complete systems of beliefs which are amazingly similar to the doctrines of modern socialism. One of the most interesting of the ancient Chinese experiments was launched by Wang Mong, who ruled the empire about the beginning of our Christian era. Wang Mong tried to revive the ancient Chinese agrarian communities, which were something like the Russian mir. He forbade any private individual to possess more than a trin, or 12 acres of land. Better known as the evidently collectivist experiment initiated in 1069 by the minister Wang and Shi, which made the state sole proprietor of all land and all capital. Both of these efforts had been preceded by periods of discontent, and both were provoked by destructive criticism aimed at the institutions then functioning. Needless to say, both of them failed lamentably. After Wang Mong's reform had come to grief, a contemporary philosopher, grievously disappointed, it would seem, wrote that not even Yu, said to be the founder of the first Chinese dynasty, could have succeeded in reviving communal ownership of property. For everything changes. Rivers disappear from their beds, and all that time erases vanishes forever. That such anticipations of modern ideas should have been numerous is natural enough, for the sentiments on which socialism proper, as well as anarchism, so largely rests are in no sense peculiar to the generations that are at present living in Europe and America. The application of a critical, destructive spirit to the analysis of contemporary social institutions, for the purpose of supplying a basis at least ostensibly rational and systematic for demanding political recognition of the sentiments referred to, is also an ancient and altogether natural phenomenon. It may arise in any human society that has reached a certain level of maturity. This does not mean, however, that contemporary socialism descends in a direct and unbroken moral and intellectual line from any of the similar doctrines which flourished in one part of the world or another in ages more or less remote and then perished, leaving more or less perceptible traces of their propaganda upon human history. The present-day movements of socialist and anarchist reform do not go back to any religious principle. They rest on purely rationalistic foundations and are a spontaneous outgrowth of the intellectual and moral conditions that prevailed in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. Socialism and anarchism have a common seed in the doctrine which proclaims that man is good by nature and that society makes him bad, overlooking the fact that the structure of a society is nothing more than a resultant of the compromising and compensating and balancing that take place among the varied and very complex human instincts. Now the first to formulate the doctrine clearly, and the man who was its most famous champion, was Rousseau. In his works he not only explicitly formulates the notion that absolute justice must be the basis of all political institutions, and condemns, therefore, all sorts of political and economic inequality, he also is at no pains to conceal the feelings of rancor toward fortune's favorites, toward the rich and the powerful, which make up such a large part of the polemical baggage of socialists past and present. Janet writes, from Rousseau comes that hatred of property and that rage at inequalities in wealth which are such terrible assets for these modern sects. It should be noted, however, that Janet, as well as other writers who soundly regard Rousseau as the intellectual parent of modern subversive theories, quotes only the well-known passage at the beginning of the second part of Rousseau's essay on inequality. Viewed independently of the rest of the work, the passage is more declamatory than conclusive. It reads, "The first man who fenced in a plot of ground and then thought of saying this is mine, and found somebody who was fool enough to believe him, was the real founder of civilized society. How many crimes, how many wars, how much slaughter, misery, horror, would have been spared the human race, had someone torn down that fence, or filled in that trench, and cried to his neighbors, 'Do not heed that impostor. You are lost if you forget that the soil belongs to nobody and that its fruits belong to all.'" It might be objected that in the same essay Rousseau observes that a division of lands, leur partage, was a necessary consequence of their cultivation. That would be recognizing, in a sense, that there can be no civilization without private property. The most conclusive passages, we believe, come 4 or 5 pages further along. Rousseau gives a long description, after his fashion, of man's slow and gradual development from savage, animal-like living to civilized living, and notes that the more significant moments in that evolution were the discovery of metals and the discovery of agriculture. He believes, furthermore, that agriculture, and therefore private property and inequality in fortunes, preceded any social organization at all, and that there must, therefore, have been a period of anarchy when everybody was fighting everybody else and when the rich man had most to lose. At that time, allowing Rousseau to speak for himself. Alone against all, unable in view of mutual jealousies to combine with his equals against foes who stood united by a common hope of plunder, harassed by his need, the rich man conceived the shrewdest plan that has ever crept into the human mind. He would use in his own favor the very power of those who were attacking him. He would make his adversaries his defenders. He would imbue them with different principles, which would be as much in his favor as natural right had been against him. Rousseau goes on to relate how, at the suggestion of the wealthy, human beings consented to organize a government with laws which to all appearances safeguarded the life and property of all, but which in reality were of benefit only to the powerful. Finally he concludes, "Such was, or must have been, the origin of society and of laws, which laid new impediments upon the weak man and gave new power to the rich man, which destroyed natural freedom beyond recall, crystallized the law of property and inequality forever, turned shrewd usurpation into an unimpeachable right, and for the profit of a few ambitious men subjected the whole human race for all time to toil, servitude and poverty." No very profound knowledge of contemporary socialist and anarchist literature is required to perceive that the passages quoted contain in fully developed form the concept of the class struggle, in other words the idea that government is instituted for the benefit of a single class. They also contain in germ all the assumptions and sentiments that underlie the collectivist principle, which would abolish private ownership of land, capital and the instruments of labor in order to prevent the exploitation of one class for the benefit of another class. More logically still, they lead to the anarchist principle that every sort of political organization whatsoever should be abolished in order that rulers may be deprived of all means of exploiting the ruled and of governing them by violence and fraud. Rousseau's work on the origin of inequality among men was published in 1754. In it he planted seeds which were to find an amazingly fertile environment and enjoy a most luxuriant growth. Just a year later, in 1755, the natural implications of Rousseau's principles were developed in a book called Code de la Nature. Though it was uncouth in form and incoherent in substance, this code was long attributed to Diderot. Its actual author was Morley. It outlined quite clearly a program for radical social reform in a collectivist direction. Morley maintains, in the code, that there should be 3 fundamental laws in every society. 1. There should be no private property. 2. Every citizen should be a public official. 3. Every citizen should contribute to the public welfare. Starting with these 3 postulates, Morley argues that the state should feed every individual and that every individual should work for the state, and he draws a picture of a society organized according to those ideals. As a precursor and pioneer of modern collectivist ideas, Morley is perhaps entitled to greater respect than he has had, at least from his coreligionists. In 1776 the Abbé Mobley, an enlightened aristocrat who was a fairly well-known writer in his day, reached the conclusion that private property should be abolished. The Abbé's doctrines were foreshadowed for the first time in his Doute proposes aux philosophes économistes, a work published in 1768 in rejoinder to a book published the year before by Le Mercier de la Rivière, L'ordre naturel et essentiel des sociétés politiques. Mobley's second work on the subject of land communism was his De la legislation ou principes des lois. There he formulates an imaginary objection that, if a division of land were to be made, inequality would shortly be re-established. His answer was, it is not a question of land division, but of community of lands. It is not a question of redistributing property. Property has to be abolished. It is significant that Rousseau often accused Mobley of plagiarism. A close parallel to Proudhon's famous phrase, properly is theft, la propriété c'est le volume, first appeared in a pamphlet that was published by Brissot de Warville in 1778, under the title of Recherches philosophiques sur la propriété et sur le volume. There we find the words la propriété exclusive et un volume. Brissot became one of the outstanding leaders of the Girondist party during the Revolution, heading the faction called the Brissotins. He was often in trouble because of the book and the phrase. Whether the men who directed the great revolutionary movement in France at the end of the 18th century were or were not tinged with socialist doctrines has long been hotly debated. Prior to 1848, Louis Blanc held that they were, and Quinet, relying principally on the memoirs of Baudot, a member of the convention, held that they were not. It seems evident to us that socialism is a necessary consequence of pure democracy, if by democracy we mean a denial of any social superiority that is not based upon the free consent of majorities. On this point we wholly agree with Stahl, and wholly disagree with Tocqueville and others. But to say that a consequence is necessary is not to say that it is going to follow immediately. It is natural that a certain time should elapse between the attempt to realize absolute equality in the political field and the attempt to achieve equality in the economic field, since experience alone can teach that political equality is altogether illusory unless it leads to economic equality. During the period between 1789 and 1793, the theories that officially prevailed in the various legislative and constituent assemblies were what socialists of today would call individualistic or bourgeois. That was partly because experience was wanting and partly because socialist doctrines were still in their infancy and had not yet been carefully worked out and embodied in systems that were scientific in appearance at least. More important still, if the leaders of the active revolutionaries were soldiers, they were satisfied with changing from sergeants to generals in a few years' time. And if they were lawyers, they were satisfied to save their necks from the guillotine and become legislators, proconsuls, committeemen on public safety, and whatnot, or at the very least high government officials. Soldiers or lawyers, or just peasants, all of them were as content as could be if they could buy the private property of an émigré from the state with a fistful of fiat money. The truth is that even if bourgeois or capitalist doctrines prevailed, the instincts and passions that were then rife were of quite another color. And if war was not waged officially on wealth and private property in general, it was waged, in general with great effectiveness, on property owners and wealthy men. It would be a simple matter to mention facts and quote speeches from those days that show perfect accord with the aspirations of revolutionary socialists of half a century later and of our time. In his newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, Marat wrote that their worthies, the grocers, the drummers, the salis-clerks, were conspiring against the revolution with the gentlemen on the right of the convention and with gentlemen of wealth, that they ought to be arrested as suspects, every one, and that they could be turned into first-class sans-culottes, by leaving them nothing to cover their behinds with. Cambon proposed a forced loan of $1 million from the rich to be secured by mortgages on the property of émigrés. A decree of September 3, 1793, confiscated all incomes over 14,000 francs a year under guise of a forced loan. There were men in the convention who considered wealth a sin and denounced any man as a bad citizen who could not be satisfied with an income of 3,000 francs a year. The conventionist Laplanche was sent on a mission to the Department of the Share and reported on his work as follows to the Jacobins: "Everywhere I made terror the order of the day. Everywhere I exacted contributions from the rich and aristocratic. I threw all Federalists out of office, put all suspects in jail, and upheld the sans-culottes by force of arms." In the Jacobin Club itself a proposal was made to confiscate all foodstuffs and distribute them among the people, and when manufacturers closed their mills, Chaumet, the Attorney General, proposed that the Republic take over all factories and raw materials. Nevertheless, when the revolutionary movement was already in its decline, we find an attempt to realize absolute equality and end oppression and privilege by abolishing private property and concentrating all wealth in the hands of the state. That was the goal that the famous Kees Gracchus Babeuf set out to attain. The conspiracy of the equals which he headed, gathered in all surviving Jacobins who thought they could find in socialist ideas, which, as we have seen, were not unknown at the end of the 18th century, a force that might revive the revolution, which was showing signs of petering out either into anarchy or into Caesarism. His conspiracy frustrated, Babeuf was guillotined in 1797. A comrade of his, an Italian named Buonarroti, supplies a link between the socialists of the 18th century and those of the first half of the 19th. Buonarroti clearly expounded the doctrines of his master in a book that appeared in 1826, De la Conspiration pour l'égalité, Ditch de Babeuf. It contains all the essentials of the doctrine that the state should become sole proprietor of land and capital. It is interesting that Buonarroti later became one of the founders of the Carbonari, and in fact played a leading role in all the activities of secret societies that kept France and Italy continually on edge after the fall of Napoleon's empire. Buonarroti's book had a great influence on the intellectual training of all the revolutionary conventicles that formed in France shortly before and especially after the Revolution of 1880. Then passions and thoughts began to stir in the direction of a radical reform of society, and the atmosphere for the first time became definitely socialistic. Fourier and Saint-Simon really antedate Buonarroti by a few years. Fourier had published his Théorie des quatre movements as early as 1808, but the Association domestique et agricole did not appear until 1822 and the Nouveau Monde Industriel not until 1829. Saint-Simon's Nouveau Christianisme came out in 1824. He died the year following. As for Saint-Simon, his last publication did in a sense come pretty close to socialism on the sentimental side, and the Saint Simon Inizra that flourished after 1880 helped to prepare the ground for socialism proper. It actually anticipated many of the views which later were adopted by socialism. All the same, the thought that Saint-Simon develops in his earlier publications is too vast, too profound and too original to allow him to be mentioned outright as merely one of the many writers who heralded the rise of social democracy as we know it, below, Chapter 12, Section 1. During the 10 or 15 years after 1830, socialism was enriched by the publications of Pierre Leroux, Louis Blanc, and Proudhon, not to mention lesser lights. If one looks attentively, one can detect in the rich blossoming of reform ideas that took place in France between 1820 and 1848 all the varieties and gradations of present-day socialism. There is the legalitarian socialism of Fourier, and the revolutionary socialism of Blanc. Proudhon has all the seeds of modern anarchism. Lucas will do for Christian socialism. If we go looking for indirect methods of propaganda, we may note a now forgotten proletarian novel, The Voyage en Icary by Cabet, which appeared in 1840 and made a great sensation. In it Cabet imagines that he has arrived in a country where there is no private property and describes the bliss that men enjoy under such a system. About 50 years later Bellamy cut is looking backward out of virtually the same cloth. Icaria, however, was a not altogether imaginary utopia. Cabet set up his ideal state in the United States, first in Texas and later at Nauvoo, Illinois, on the Mississippi River. Lie died in St. Louis. 2. But suppose a close reading of socialist writers before 1848, almost all of them French, has convinced one that they left little or nothing for the Germans who followed after them to invent. Suppose we perceive that Marx did nothing but develop systematically, in a more strictly logical form and with a broader knowledge of classical economics and of Hegelian philosophy too, principles that had already been formulated by Buonarroti, Leroux, Blanc and, especially, Proudhon. Still it will be true that the socialism of today is a far more disquieting social phenomenon than the socialism of 60 years ago. It is immeasurably more widespread, for one thing. Instead of being confined almost entirely to the great cities of France, and more particularly to Paris, it now embraces almost the whole of Europe, and it has invaded the United States and Australia. Call it a good, call it an evil, it is at any rate common to all peoples of European civilization. Nor has it gained any less in depth than in surface. Revolutionary instincts and noble aspirations once found an objective and an outlet in the strictly democratic movement, or in various movements for the liberation of one subject nationality or another. But now representative governments on broad-based suffrage have been introduced almost everywhere, they have even had time to result in the disappointments of parliamentarism. Italian and German national unities have for some time been virtually complete, and the Polish question seems to all intents and purposes to be settled. Now all disinterested enthusiasms are concentrated in aspirations toward substantial reforms in the prevailing social order. A time has come when many souls are athirst for justice, and are welling with the hope of being able to quench the thirst very soon. No longer a lonely thinker, a solitary man of heart, would be he who considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter, and on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comforter. And the author of Ecclesiastes continues, Wherefore I praise the dead which are already dead more than the living which are yet alive. Yea, better is he than both they, which hath not yet been, who hath not seen the evil work that is done under the sun. It is instructive to note that this melancholy, realistic attitude toward society is to be found in the writings of other thinkers who lived among peoples of ancient culture. It is undoubtedly the product of a refinement of moral sense, and of a lucid perception of realities, which only a long period of civilization makes possible, and then only in a few men of lofty minds and noble hearts. With the general perception of the evil comes confidence in the possibility of promptly alleviating it. The early Christians believed in the imminent coming of the kingdom of God, which would banish all evil from the world, reward the good and punish the wicked. That faith finds its counterpart in a conviction that is now spread abroad through all strata in society, that most of the iniquities that are to be found in the world can be ascribed to the manner in which society is at present organized, and that they could be avoided if only those who hold power over society were not tools of the rich and the powerful, and would consent to interfere effectively in behalf of the oppressed. This persuasion has now conquered many minds and is warming many hearts. There is a widespread conviction that there is a social question, that important reforms in property rights, in the family, in our whole industrial and capitalistic system, must inevitably and shortly come about, and governors and sovereigns do little else than make efforts and promises in that direction. Now all that contributes to creating an intellectual and moral environment in which militant socialism lives, prospers and spreads abroad. In this favoring environment, two very populous political organizations have grown up about most revered masters and organizers, each of them with its aspirations, its platforms, its fairly definite and defined doctrines, two real churches, one might almost say. The one is made up of believers in collectivism, the other of believers in anarchy. Both, like religious communities, have a certain urge toward universality. If they do not send out missionaries to convert the heathen, they do spread their propaganda abroad among almost all the nations of European civilization. And in one of them more particularly, in the collectivist organization, in spite of frequent schisms and the rise of numerous heresiarchs, which are phenomena common to all organizations that are young and full of life, we see the leaders and inspirers meeting frequently in national and world councils, discussing dogma, discipline, the party's line, and fixing norms and methods that straightway are universally accepted by masses of believers. 3. Succinctly to state the postulates of collectivism is easy enough. They are now familiar to everybody. In the old parliament in Germany, the collectivist movement took the name social democracy, which we regard as the designation scientifically most apt for it. According to the doctrine most generally recognized as orthodox, the state represents the collectivity of citizens. It is sole proprietor of all tools of production, whether they be capital proper, machinery or land. The state is the sole director and the sole distributor of economic products. Since there are neither owners of real property nor private capitalists, everybody works for the benefit of society as a whole, and the social organism provides for all, either according to the needs of each individual, as a simpler and older formula would have it, or according to the work that the individual does, as a newer formula that is now more generally accepted contends. To be strictly accurate, followers of the first formula are known among socialists as communists, while those who follow the other, which is much more in vogue among the many disciples of Marx, are technically styled collectivists. As a matter of fact, many collectivists grant that communism is the ideal goal, but it has the drawback, they think, of not being immediately realizable. As will be apparent farther along, while collectivism is a concession that reformers make to the well-known frailty or, better, selfishness, of human nature, it greatly complicates the system of social regeneration which collectivists are trying to bring about and offers the greater number of sound arguments to their opponents, the communists. The whole machine so organized is administered and directed by leaders who represent the people. The function of the leaders is to dole out to everyone the type of work for which he is best fitted, to see to it that the products of labor and social capital are not squandered or unduly exploited, and at the same time to distribute to every individual, with perfect equity and justice, the exact share that is due him either as the product of his own labor as honestly and infallibly calculated, or for his own needs, of which those in control will, with the same impartiality, furnish the exact estimate. Suppose now we ignore the violence and the civil strife which may justly be considered indispensable to carrying out this program, and which certainly would only intensify hatreds, rancors and greeds, cleave populations into victors and vanquished, put the latter at the mercy of the former and so unleash the wickedest of human instincts. Let us go so far as to assume that the reforms mentioned have come about peacefully and by common agreement, or that revolving centuries have quenched the last echo of the fratricidal wars with which the new type of social organization has been inaugurated. Let us go on and assume that the productivity and total wealth of society have not been appreciably diminished by the new system, as the economists insist and have, in our opinion, indisputably proved. We are even ready to grant that the ethical side of the social problem should have absolute predominance over the strictly economic side, and that the little that is well divided should be preferable to the much that is badly divided. But, after conceding that much, it is our right and our duty to ask a question on our side, and we shall call it political, because it is the broadest, the most comprehensive question imaginable, because it arises of its own accord from a comprehensive examination of every type of social relation, because its solution should interest orthodox economists no less than socialists, capitalists no less than workers, the rich no less than the poor, because it is the first question, the most important question, for all noble hearts, all unprejudiced minds which set above every creed and every interest of party the dispassionate search for a social adjustment that shall represent the greatest good that it is within the power of our poor humanity to attain. It is our right and our duty to ask whether, with the realization of the communist, or of the collectivist, system, justice, truth, love and reciprocal toleration among men, will hold a larger place in the world than they now occupy, whether the strong, who will always be at the two, will be less overbearing, whether the weak, who will always be at the bottom, will be less overborne. That question we now answer decidedly with the word no. The late Saverio Scolari once said that it was impossible for the student of the historical or political sciences to foresee exactly what is going to happen in human societies in any future, near or remote, because some part in human events will always be due to what is called chance, and we shall never be able to calculate that factor in advance. He added, however, that we are much better able to foresee what is never going to happen, the negative reasoning having a secure foundation in what we know of human nature, which will never allow anything actually to occur that is fundamentally repugnant to it. This second dictum seems much to the point in the case we now have before us, and its application should be all the easier since to a great extent we are concerned not with foreseeing what will or will not happen but simply with noting what has happened and is happening every day. The much that we know from experience makes it easy to establish the nature of the little that some still consider unknown. Communist and collectivist societies would beyond any doubt be managed by officials. Let us assume, for the best case, that in accord with the norms of social democracy, they would be elected exclusively by universal suffrage. We have already seen how political powers function when they are exclusively, or almost exclusively, in the hands of so-called people's choices. We know that majorities have only the mere right of choosing between a few possible candidates, and that they cannot, therefore, exercise over them anything more than a spasmodic, limited and often ineffective control. We know that the selection of candidates is itself almost always the work of organized minorities who specialize by taste or vocation in politics and electioneering, or else the work of caucuses and committees whose interests are often at variance with the interests of the majority. We know the ruses that the worst of them use to nullify or falsify the verdicts of the polls to their advantage. We know the lies they tell, the promises they make and betray, and the violence they do in order to win or to wheedle votes. But communists and collectivists may object that all this happens because of the present capitalistic organization of society, because great landowners and owners of great fortunes now have 1,000 means, direct or indirect, for influencing and buying the votes of the poor, and that they use them to make universal suffrage a sham and assure political dominion to themselves. To avoid those drawbacks, if for nothing else, they might argue, we should change the social order radically. Those who reason in that manner forget the most important detail in the problem. They forget that even in societies organized as they propose there would still be those who would manage the public wealth and then the great mass of those who are managed. Now the latter would have to be satisfied with the share that was allotted to them. The administrators of the social republic would also be its political heads, and they would undoubtedly be far more powerful than the ministers and millionaires we know today. If a man has the power to constrain others to a given task, and to fix the allotments of material enjoyments and moral satisfactions that will be the recompense for the performance of the task, he will always be a despot over his fellows, however much he may be curbed by laws and regulations, and he will always be able to sway their consciences and their wills to his advantage. All the lying, all the baseness, all the violence, all the fraud that we see in political life at present are used in intrigues to win votes, in order to get ahead in public office or simply in order to make money fast by unscrupulous means. Under a collectivist system everything of that sort would be aimed at controlling the administration of the collective enterprise. There would be one goal for the greedy, the shrewd and the violent, one direction for the cabals and the cliques which would form to the detriment of the gentler, the fairer, the more sincere. Such differences as there would all be in favor of our present society, for to destroy multiplicity of political forces, that variety of ways and means by which social importance is at present acquired, would be to destroy all independence and all possibility of reciprocal balancing and control. As things are today, the office clerk can at least laugh at the millionaire. A good workman who can earn a decent living with his own hands has nothing to fear from the politician, the department secretary, the deputy or the minister. Anyone who has a respectable position as the owner of a piece of land, as a businessman, as a member of a profession, can hold his head high before all the powers of the state and all the great landlords and financial barons in the world. Under collectivism, everyone will have to kowtow to the men in the government. They alone can dispense favor, bread, the joy or sorrow of life. One single crushing, all-embracing, all-engrossing tyranny will weigh upon all. The great of the earth will be absolute masters of everything, and the independent word of the man who fears nothing and expects nothing from them will no longer be there to curb their extravagances. In his Progress and Poverty, Henry George many times quotes an ancient Hindu document which held that elephants insanely proud and parasols embroidered in gold were the fruits of private ownership of the land. In our day, civilization is much more sophisticated than that, and life more many-sided. Wealth is producing a great deal besides elephants and parasols. But, after all, the privileges that wealth confers on those who possess it come down to the fact that wealth makes the pursuit of intellectual pleasures easier and the enjoyment of material pleasures more abundant. It provides satisfactions for vanity and pride and, especially, power to manipulate the wills of others while leaving one's own independence intact. The heads of a communist or collectivist republic would control the will of others more tyrannically than ever, and since they would be able to distribute privations or favors as they chose, they would have the means to enjoy, perhaps more hypocritically but in no less abundance, all the material pleasures, all the triumphs of vanity, which are now perquisites of the powerful and then the wealthy. Like these, and even more than these, they would be in a position to degrade the dignity of other men. These criticisms, it will be noted, bear both on the postulates of communism and on the postulates of collectivism, and perhaps on the former more than on the latter. But, from the standpoint of the criticisms, collectivism is considerably worse placed than communism. If orthodox social democracy were to triumph, those in control would not only have the right to fix for everybody the kind of work to be done and the place where it was to be done, but, since there would be no automatic measure of reward, they would have to specify the return on every type of work. That they would have far greater latitude for arbitrary decisions and favoritism is obvious. Nor would that be all. Collectivism does not allow any accumulation of private wealth in the form of industrial capital, but only in kind, in the form of commodities of pure consumption. It would certainly always be possible to distribute such commodities either gratis or for a consideration, and so electoral corruption, and the many other forms of corruption that feature bourgeois societies, would reappear. 4. The strength of the socialist and anarchist doctrines lies not so much in their positive as in their negative aspects in their minute, pointed, merciless criticism of our present organization of society. From the standpoint of absolute justice, the distribution of wealth that has prevailed in the past, and still prevails, leaves plenty of room for many very serious criticisms in that it legitimizes great and flagrant injustices. That fact is so evident that even to state it seems quite platitudinous. One does not need the piercing keenness of Proudhon, the long algebraic demonstrations of Marx, the trenchant, savage irony of Lassalle, to prove what so readily strikes the eye of anyone who looks, even of the most superficial and untaught observer. Individual enjoyment of the good things of life has not been proportioned even to the value, let alone to the difficulty, of the work that is done to produce them. We see in economic life what we see every day in political life, in scientific life, in all fields of social activity, that success is almost never proportionate to merit. Between the service that an individual renders to society and the reward that he receives there is almost always a wide, and often a glaring, discrepancy. To fight socialism by trying to deny, or merely to extenuate, that fact is to take one stand on a terrain on which defeat is certain. Orthodox economists have often tried that. They have sought to show that private ownership of land and capital not only is beneficial, or even indispensable, to life in society, but also answers the absolute requirements of morality and justice. Along that line they have opened their flank to a very powerful attack. Precarious, nay hopeless, in the best case and in any age, their thesis becomes patently absurd in our day, when everybody who has eyes can see by what means great fortunes are often built up. The whole objection that can be offered, and should be offered, to the destructive criticism of the socialists is summed up in a truth that may seem cruel. We have already stated it, but it is helpful, it is moral, to proclaim it aloud over and over again. No nodal organization can be based exclusively upon the sentiment of justice, and no social organization will ever fail to leave much to be desired from the standpoint of absolute justice. It is natural that things should be that way. In his private and public conduct no individual is ever guided exclusively by his sense of justice. He is guided by his passions and his needs. Only the man who cuts himself off from the world, who renounces all ambition for wealth, power, worldly vanity, for expressing his own personality in any way whatever, can flatter himself that his acts are inspired by a sentiment of absolute justice. The man of action, in political life or in business life, whether he be merchant or property owner, professional worker or laborer, priest of God or apostle of socialism, always tries to be a success, And his conduct, therefore, will always be a compromise, witting or unwitting, between his sense of justice and his interests. Of course, not all people compromise to the same degree or in the same ways. The type and extent of compromises depend upon the person's greater or lesser selfishness, on his sense of delicacy, on the strength of his moral convictions. These traits vary widely from individual to individual. Human sentiments being what they are, to set out to erect a type of political organization that will correspond in all respects to the ideal of justice, which a man can conceive but can never attain, is a utopia, and the utopia becomes frankly dangerous when it succeeds in bringing a large mass of intellectual and moral energies to bear upon the achievement of an end that will never be achieved and that, on the day of its purported achievement, can mean nothing more than triumph for the worst people and distress and disappointment for the good. Burke remarked more than a century ago that any political system that assumes the existence of superhuman or heroic virtues can result only in vice and corruption. The doctors of socialism declare that all, or at least most, human imperfections, all or most of the injustices that are now being committed under the sun, do not result from ethical traits that are natural to our species but from traits that are thrust upon us by our present bourgeois organization of society. One such doctor stated explicitly in a famous book that if we change social conditions in accord with the goals that socialism sets for itself, we shall get a radical change in human nature. We shall not do the reformers of today the injustice of supposing that they are trying to revive under a new form Rousseau's old aphorism that man is born good and society makes him bad. If one were to accept that view unconditionally, one would also be obliged to assume that society is not the result of the natural and spontaneous activity of human beings but was set up by some superhuman or extrahuman will, which amused itself by giving us laws, institutions and morals that have poisoned and upset the innate goodness, generosity and magnanimity of the seed of Adam. Modern socialists cannot imagine, either, that our present social organization merely reflects the instincts of other races, other generations of men, whose moral sense must have been much lower than that of the present generation, so that we, noble and enlightened as we are, feel an urgent need of stripping ourselves, as of the shirt of Nessus, of institutions that have been inherited from unscrupulous elders. If we were to grant that method of applying evolutionary theories to human societies, if we were to grant that within a few centuries selection has considerably improved the average level of mortality, we would also have to assume that the moral progress that has already been achieved should appreciably have diminished, rather than increased, the defects of bourgeois organization. Nothing of that sort has taken place. Keeping to what the socialists themselves say, men have not become less selfish, less hard of heart. For if the contrary were the case, if, in the eyes of men, an atom of self-interest had not often outbalanced a great weight of other people's interest and self-respect, if a whole society were in large majority made up of just and compassionate men, of upright and sincere people, as was pleasing to the Lord of Israel and as would surely have been pleasing to Messrs. Marx and Lassalle, all the deadly consequences of rapacious capitalism and frantic competition which have been revealed by those writers with such rare mastery would certainly by now have been reduced to the lowest terms. The world could become an Eden even under the present bourgeois organization of society if every capitalist were to content himself with an honest, moderate profit and did not try to ruin his competitors, squeeze the last possible penny from the consumer's pocket and force the last drop of sweat from the brow of the working man. In such an Eden, the landowner would cultivate his fields diligently and extract from them only the bare necessaries for his frugal subsistence. He would not take advantage of market fluctuations in order to sell commodities a prime necessity at the highest obtainable price. The merchant too would collect just a moderate and specified profit on his sale, and never take advantage of the buyer's inexperience to sell dearer, or cheat him as to the quality and quantity of his wares. The working man and the peasant would toil conscientiously for their employer, doing no more arid no less than they would do for themselves, never deceiving him, never pilfering from him, never taking a day's wages for half a day's work. Then all of them together, instead of wasting their surplus or their savings on ostentatious luxuries, on satisfying vanities, on vice and good times, would seek out the wretched, the poor, those who are not good at making a living, and spend everything on aiding them, so that for one hand that would be extended for help there would be 10 hands ready and eager to give it. Henry George was certainly a man of noble heart and penetrating mind. He thought that all the evils that we ascribe to selfishness, and to lack of fairness and brotherly consideration in the majority of men, were due to the competitive system and more particularly to the danger of wanting the necessaries of life that confronts us all under the present system. Upholding that thesis in Progress and Poverty, George mentions as an example what occurs at any well-served table, where each diner, knowing that there is food enough for all, is polite to his neighbor. No vulgar struggle to snatch the choice morsels arises, and no one tries to get more food than anybody else. Now we do not think that the analogy holds. In the first place, there are well-served boards where the behavior of guests is not as correct as the conduct that Henry George describes. In the second place, material appetites are necessarily limited. As Sancho Panza pointed out, the poor man eats 3 times a day and the rich man can do no better. At a well-served table, therefore, everyone can find a way to satisfy, let us say a gargantuan, hunger without pilfering his neighbor's portion. But that is not the case when we are sitting at the allegorical banquet of life. Then the will to get the better of others, to satisfy one's caprices, passions, lusts, can, unhappily, be boundless and insatiable. A man will try to have 10, 100, 1,000 portions, so that by distributing them among others he may bend them to his will. In the struggle for preeminence, that man triumphs who can most lavishly dispense the means by which human needs and human vices are satisfied. Even if each of us were to be assured of a minimum that would provide for the prime necessities of life, the social question would not be solved. Only the weakest and least aggressive would content themselves with that minimum, those who in any event would be least well adapted to the struggle for preeminence. The others would go on scrambling in rabid competition. It follows that the most realistic interpretation that can at present be given to the doctrine of Rousseau is the very one that is followed by large numbers of those who are fighting in the ranks of the collectivist movement, or even among the anarchists. They believe that the natural working of selection has been profoundly disturbed and perverted by present bourgeois societies, and that principle will be able to operate freely and exert its beneficial effects only when their programs of reform, which vary from school to school, have been carried out. But in reasoning in that fashion, they are discounting an expectation, and there will never be any possibility of proving in advance that it will be realized. Also, they are evidently counting on a moral progress which they say will be attained, in order to bring into existence a type of social organization which assumes that progress has already been attained, and which in all probability would be able to function only if that progress had been attained. In a word, they would only be repeating oil a large scale, and with more disastrous consequences, the mistake to which we primarily owe the current evils of parliamentarism. But, if the dispassionate study of the past can tell us anything, it tells us, as we believe we have shown, Chapter 7, Section 7, that it is difficult to modify very appreciably the mean moral level of a whole people of long-standing civilization, and that the influence that one type of social organization or another can exert in that direction is certainly far less powerful than the radicals of our day imagine. History teaches that whenever, in the course of the ages, a social organization has exerted such an influence in a beneficial way, it has done so because the individual and collective will of the men who have held power in their hands has been curbed and balanced by other men, who have occupied positions of absolute independence and have had no common interests with those whom they have had to curb and balance. It has been necessary, nay indispensable, that there should be a multiplicity of political forces, that there should be many different roads by which social importance could be acquired, and that the various political forces should each be represented in the government and in the administration of the state. Collectivism and communism, like all doctrines that are based on the passions and the blind faith of the masses, tend to destroy multiplicity of political forces. They would confine all power to individuals elected by the people, or representing them. They would abolish private wealth, which in all mature societies has supplied many individuals with a means for acquiring independence and prestige apart from the assent and consent of the rulers of the state. Both those things can only lead to a weakening of juridical defense, to what in plain language is called the tyranny of rulers over the ruled. In practice, such tyranny has always resulted from oversimplified political doctrines which take no account of the complicated and difficult structure of human nature, but try to adapt the organization of society to a single, one-sided, absolute concept and establish it upon a single exclusive principle. Now the will of God is interpreted by his earthly vicars and ministers, now the will of the people is expressed through those who claim to represent them. Of course, sound political doctrine may suggest legislative remedies and recommend procedures that might well lessen social injustice to a certain extent. The mechanism of juridical defense might be improved in such a way as to moderate the arrogance of those who are invested with public power. But however great the benefits that might be yielded by reforms along those lines, they would be insignificant as compared with the era of happiness, equality and universal justice which, implicitly or explicitly, the various socialist schools promise to their followers. They would be something like the few doubtful years of fair physical health which the conscientious doctor is able to guarantee his patient. A very paltry guarantee, when one thinks of the nuisance that goes with diets and a strict daily observance of medical rules. And paltry especially if it be compared with the promise of a quick and certain cure, of good health and long life that is made by the charlatan with his elixir. It might be urged that from the moral point of view this analogy is not applicable to men who are propounding their ideas in all good faith. Besides, The physician might well show the fatuousness of the patent medicine and then be obliged to evade the challenge of the charlatan to invent a medicine that would really do what the charlatan's elixir was alleged to do. If the physician were wise, he would answer that he realizes very well how many germs there are in the world, and how varied and numerous the diseases that may upset the delicate constitution of the human body, but that for that very reason he will never claim that he has a universal and infallible remedy for all diseases. Merely to think of doing so would put him on a level with the charlatan. 5. Anarchist propaganda bases its destructive criticism of present-day institutions on the same passions, the same order of observations and ideas, as collectivist propaganda, with this difference, that anarchists are as a rule more violent. Sometimes they are actually ferocious not only in their acts but in their words. We are thinking of one publication, among many others, in which an Italian anarchist advises the workers on the day of their victory to wipe out not only grown bourgeois who are captured arms in hand, but also the aged and the helpless and women and children down to 2 or 3 years, to deal with the bourgeois, in short, the way the ancient Hebrews dealt with the conquered whenever these had been expressly smitten by Jehovah's curse. The publication is so well written that its author must have been a well-educated man of fair native intelligence. However, the anarchists differ widely from all the socialist schools in the ideals which they set out to achieve. In order to abolish, or at least considerably reduce, the injustices and inequalities they deplore in this world, the socialists would try to modify the present organization of society, very radically to be sure. The anarchists, soundly arguing that there would always be disparities of status among men under any type of social organization, that there would always be rulers and ruled, or, as they put it, exploiters and exploited, propose the destruction of all organized society. They remind one of a man who discovers that there is no prudent tenor of life that can guarantee him perfect health and so turns to suicide as a sure cure for all his troubles. Logical and consistent followers of Rousseau, the father of them all, the adherents of anarchism maintain that since organized society is the root of all evil, only by completely disorganizing human society and going back to the state of nature can evil be eliminated. In this they are only repeating, perhaps unwittingly, a mistake of their master. The truth is that the natural state, with man as with many other animals, is not individual separation but social living, the only variation being that the society may be more or less large, more or less organized. To assume, then, that a fact so universal and so readily discernible as the fact that all men live socially can be due to the self-interest and cunning of a few schemers is a notion which we are certainly not the first to call absurd and childish. Aristotle lived 20 centuries before the Genevan philosopher, yet he had an infinitely clearer and more accurate perception of the real nature of man when he wrote that man is a political animal. But the intellectual faculties of the Greek peripatetic were probably never ruffled either by an oversensitive pride or by literary vanity. One might even guess that the patronage of the Macedonian sovereigns, or perhaps his ability to earn his own living, saved him from the necessity of souring his disposition and ruining his digestion by hobnobbing with people who were often frivolous, sometimes spiteful and almost always of high social standing. Rousseau came of a respectable Genevan family, and he inherited its honest and upright instincts. But because of his irresponsibility, his inability to adapt himself to modest, profitable work, and the destitution in which his father left him, he decayed morally to the point where for 10 years or more he lived as a not always welcome chevalier of Madame de Warens for the support that she gave him. Awareness of the moral degradation into which he had fallen in his youth must no doubt have been one of the keenest torments to the Genevan philosopher in his maturity. Being unwilling or unable to blame himself, his father, or Madame de Warens, he blamed society. That, in our opinion, is the real psychological explanation of the fundamental idea that serves Rousseau as a basis for his whole political and social system, that man is born good and society makes him bad. But suppose we assume that the anarchist hypothesis has come about in the fact that the present type of social organization has been destroyed, that nations and governments have ceased to exist, and that standing armies, bureaucrats, parliaments and especially policemen and jails have been swept away. Unfortunately, people would still have to live, and therefore use the land and other instruments of production. Unfortunately again, arms and weapons would still be there, and enterprising, courageous characters would be ready to use them in order to make others their servants or slaves. Given those elements, little social groups would at once form, and in them the many would toil while the few, armed and organized, would either be robbing them or protecting them from other robbers, but living on their toil in any event. In other words, we should be going back to the simple, primitive type of social organization in which each group of armed men is absolute master of some plot of ground and of those who cultivate it, so long as the group can conquer the plot of ground and hold it with its own strength. That type of society we have called feudal. We would have happening over again exactly what happened in Europe when the collapse of Charlemagne's empire disrupted such little social organization as had survived the fall of the Roman Empire, and what happened in India when the successors of the Grand Mogul were reduced to impotence, and what will happen everywhere when a society of advanced culture, for one cause or another, internal or external, falls apart and collapses. There can be no doubt that people who feel self-confident and strong and have nothing to lose would stand a chance to be the gainers by a revolution of that sort, for violence and personal valor would come to the top as the one political force. But it would be to the disadvantage of the immense peaceable majority, perhaps 90% of men, who would prefer to the rule of the mailed fist a very imperfect social justice, a little tranquility, and the certainty that they could enjoy at least some portion of the fruits of their own labor. While most anarchists, for instance Grave, believe that to abolish property and laws would suffice to make all men good, others, less ingenuous, arrive at conclusions that are more or less like our own. De Gramont wrote, "Given the absence of any law whatsoever, the ascendancy of superior people would become the only law, and their justifiable despotism would be undisputed. Despotism is necessary in order to muzzle imbeciles. The man without intelligence bites. Instead of superior, we would say stronger people. Instead of imbeciles, we would say the weaker people. Otherwise we would agree with de Gramont, except that we view life as a whole from a completely different standpoint. In order not to arouse too many false hopes, one ought really to give fair warning that the blessings which the triumph of anarchy would bring us would be a few years, perhaps a few generations, in coming. If it took centuries and centuries for the world to advance from barbarism to our present level of civilization, 1 or 2 centuries at least would have to pass before it could forget its civilized ways and revert to a state of just ordinary barbarism. If the aim is to get back to a real and absolute barbarism, to the status of tribes living by hunting, fishing or nomadic agriculture, then it would take longer still, the time required for an old and thickly populated Europe to dwindle in population to a bare 20th of what it is today. Unless, of course, in order to speed up the process, the defenders of anarchy would be willing not only to exterminate the bourgeois, and the satellites and sycophants of the bourgeois, as they say, but also to kill the great majority of people in the exploited classes over whose lot they are now shedding so many tears. Among the novels that were published toward the end of the 19th century, describing what the world would be like after the triumph of the social revolution, there was one which, though popular in the Anglo-Saxon world, was not widely known on the continent. Fantastic as the story is, it seems to come closer to reality than many more popular conceptions succeed in doing, and it is therefore more pessimistic. Caesar's Column was published in Chicago in 1890 by Ignatius Donnelly, Edmund Boyce Gilbert. It describes the triumph that the proletariat is to win over the plutocracy a few centuries hence, when a day of social justice comes to end centuries of bourgeois injustice. Caesar Lomellini, the leader of the proletarians, seizes the treasures, the wines and the women of Cabano, prince of the plutocrats, proclaims them his own and then abandons himself to orgies and cruelties. Meanwhile Europe, America and Australia are being drenched in the blood of a frightful carnage. The victorious workers annihilate the plutocrats and their satellites and consume the provisions that have accumulated. Then they turn against one another and kill until 3/4 of the world's population and all civilization have perished. The novel closes with a scene where Lomellini causes a column of human skulls and crossbones, Caesar's Column, to be erected in memory of all that has happened. An inscription on it entreats all who come after, in case they feel inclined to go out and found a new civilization, to keep clear of the corruption, the iniquity, the falsehood, that caused the downfall of our present bourgeois society. 6. A doctrine common to all parties of subversion, whether anarchist or merely socialist, is the so-called doctrine of the class struggle. Developed with some fullness for the first time by Marx, it is one of the best war horses of all opponents of the present organization of society. First of all, one must point out that the doctrine is based on an incomplete, one-sided and biased examination of history, to the end of proving that the whole activity of civilized society so far has been accounted for in efforts of ruling classes to keep themselves in power and to exploit power to their advantage, and in efforts of lower classes to throw off that yoke. Now, in the past of all peoples one finds social events of the first importance that can in no way be crowded into the narrow frame of that picture, for instance, the struggles of Greece against Persia and of Rome against Carthage, the rapid and tremendous growth of Christianity and Mohammedanism, the Crusades and even the revival of Italian nationality called the Risorgimento, which, as Angelo Mestaglia, a witty and learned economist, used to say, was much more due to the influence of poets and novelists than to economic factors. It is interesting to recall that when Hannibal marched into Italy and won a number of victories over the Romans, the masses in many Italian cities began to side with the Carthaginian general, whereas the patricians for the most part remained loyal to Rome. Such a fact is easily understandable. The poor are always more desirous of change, and they also have less political intuition than ruling classes. In the Crusades, too, especially toward the end, love of gain was mixed in with religious fanaticism. But the presence of an economic factor in a social phenomenon does not mean that it is necessarily the main factor, much less that it actually caused the phenomenon. Coming to civil wars, which should be especially likely to reflect struggles of class, it is noteworthy that, at this point too, the social phenomenon is described by socialists in an incomplete and therefore mistaken manner. From time to time in history one meets examples of violent uprisings by the poorer classes, or by parts of them, the Helot rebellions in Sparta, the slave wars in Rome, the jacqueries in France, and the movements among peasants or miners that have broken out in Germany, England, or Russia in days gone by. Such outbreaks have sometimes been occasioned by unusual and truly unbearable oppression. More frequently they have been due to governmental disturbances, with the beginnings of which the insurgents had nothing to do, but which did offer them a chance to get arms and acquire a rudimentary organization. In any event, movements in which the classes that live by manual labor have taken part all by themselves have regularly been repressed with relative ease and sometimes with brutality, and they have almost never helped to effect any permanent improvement in the condition of those classes. The only social conflicts, bloody or bloodless, that have resulted in actually modifying the organization of society and the composition of ruling classes, have been started by new influential elements, new political forces, rising within governed classes, but representing very small fractions of them numerically, and setting out to obtain a share in the government of the state which they thought was being withheld from them unjustly. So during the 5th and 4th centuries BC, the richer families of the Roman plebs, barred from the consulate and other prominent positions, entered upon a struggle with the old patriciate. This ended in the establishment of a broader ruling class, based on property qualifications rather than on birth alone, which became the nobility of the last centuries of the Republic. So also the portion of the French Third Estate that had, in the course of the 18th century, acquired a wealth equal to the nobilities, and a culture and aptitude for public affairs greater than the nobilities, won access to all public offices during the years after the Revolution. If it is true that in both the cases mentioned the governed masses came to enjoy the advantages of a better juridical defense, that was because their interests happened to be in accord with the interests of the new political forces that demanded admission to the governing class. It was because, in order to attain their end, the new forces had to champion principles of social utility and social justice, the application of which, if it did help them more directly, also helped the humbler members of the nation. Certainly one cannot fail to see that the process involved in those cases is one of the many ways in which the rise of new elements to social influence comes to improve the relations between rulers and ruled and render them more equitable. But that does not mean that it has ever happened that the entire mass of the governed has in fact, whatever the law, supplanted the governing minority or stood so nearly on a par with it that the distinction between the two has come to an end. Nor will this ever happen. Besides, it remains to be seen whether, for all the talk and preaching, there is anything real in this dividing society up into a parasite class that contributes nothing to production and social welfare, and enjoys the better portion of both, a class that does everything, produces everything, and is rewarded with the bare necessaries of life, and sometimes not even with that much. Not even if we isolate the phenomena involved in the production of wealth from all other social phenomena as completely as economists and their socialist adversaries sometimes do, does that theory turn out to correspond exactly to the facts. Suppose we grant that it is capital, and not the capitalist, that provides the worker with the means and opportunity for doing profitable work. Suppose we say it is the land, not the landowner, that the peasant needs. Even so, it cannot be denied that the man who knows how to get a large amount of capital into his hands and knows how to utilize it profitably for an industrial purpose, and the proprietor who knows how to manage the cultivation of his lands well, are rendering a real social service by increasing production and wealth, a service for which it is altogether proper that they should receive a remuneration. For if, further, we consider the social phenomenon as a whole, if we remember that the production of wealth is closely bound up with the level of civilization that a country attains, with the worth of its political and administrative organization, the charge of parasitism that is so lightly flung at the whole ruling class, made up of landowners, capitalists, businessmen, clerks, professional men, of all, in short, who do not live by manual labor, will seem supremely unjust. In our time, industry and agriculture are requiring applications of science more and more every day. Economic production has come to be based almost entirely upon exchanges among countries that are far removed from one another, and such exchanges are not possible unless people are grouped into great nations under governments that are intelligently organized. In the face of such facts, it is absurd to assert that everything is produced by manual laborers and that everything ought legitimately to belong to them. It is unfair to forget the services that are rendered by the class that maintains peace and order, directs the whole political and economic movement, preserves and advances higher scientific learning, and makes it possible for great masses of men to live together and cooperate. It cannot in all justice be denied that a not inconsiderable portion of economic production should be devoted to maintaining that class in all the ease that is required if it is to retain and develop its intellectual and moral leadership. For if it is certain that without the cooperation of manual laborers the directing class would be condemned to decline, and perhaps even to perish, it is none the less certain that without the elements that lead, manual laborers would lapse at once into a state of barbarism which would enormously diminish economic production, and their moral and material status would deteriorate very appreciably in consequence. On this point, the oldest lesson in sociology, the parable of the body and its members, which Menenius Agrippa related to the Roman plebs assembled on the sacred mount 2400 years ago, still remains the one that is truest to reality. A great modern liner represents the last achievements of modern industry and science. It is easy to see that it was built through the cooperation of capitalists, naval engineers and working men, and that it is operated through the cooperation of a number of officers and larger numbers of ordinary sailors and stokers. Would it be fair for the stokers and sailors and construction workers, taken as representing the part that manual labor has played in the building of the ship and in its operation, to claim the whole earnings of the liner and consider the portion that does not go to them as stolen? Obviously not, because if it is true that the capitalists, engineers and officers could never have built the vessel, and could not now run it without workmen and ordinary sailors, it is just as true that without the cooperation of capitalists, engineers and officers the manual workers could never have managed to build anything better than small boats for fishing or petty transport trade, from which, on the whole, they would have earned far less than from building and operating a liner. Thinking of all the various branches of social activity in some such terms, one sees that it is the combination of wealth, higher education and manual labor that produces what in some is called civilization, and on the whole improves the condition of all. In the higher classes there are goodly numbers of parasites or exploiters who enjoy much and consume much without rendering any real social service either in management or in execution. In those classes also there are persons who take advantage of their position in order to draw a recompense for their services that is infinitely higher than their real worth. To those elements we referred above, Chapter 5, Section 10, in speaking of social forces that are always trying to tip the juridical scales in their favor by means of their too great power, and we designated as particularly dangerous in that respect financiers, great industrialists and speculators, in general, individuals who bring great masses of private capital together into one pair of hands. However, if we look carefully at such exploitations, which are engineered in some countries by protective tariffs, and in others by banking privileges as well as protective tariffs, we have to agree that they work out to the damage both of the working classes and of the larger portion of the ruling class. The ruling class too, in its great majority, pays a high price for its weakness and ignorance, by making sacrifices that benefit only very small numbers among its members. It can be shown that protectionism cannot help one portion of a national economy without injuring another and larger portion of it at the same time. If some few property owners and manufacturers profit by protective tariffs, others, more numerous, pay the price. Those who lose, along with the poor, are the larger number of rich and well-to-do people who live on government and industrial bonds, and people who live by trade, professional earnings or salaries. A bad banking policy on the part of a government can be of help only to certain manufacturers or politicians who obtain credit by favoritism. It does harm to all other citizens and especially to people who have savings. A superficial examination of such facts is enough to show the absurdity of an accusation that is often leveled at the bourgeoisie as a whole, that it is knowingly responsible for certain evils and scandals. It would be far more accurate to say that the great majority in the ruling class, not out of malice but out of ignorance, tolerate and allow practices that are ruining them and therefore also ruining the poorer classes, whose guardianship has been entrusted not only to their probity but also to their competence and wisdom. Parasites and exploiters exist in all social strata, just as there are those who are exploited at all levels on the economic and social ladder. A man is an exploiter when he squanders a fortune in luxury, gaming and roistering, and so dissipates the capital he has inherited. And that man is exploited who laboriously and honestly accumulates the capital that the other wastes, working much, consuming little and perhaps enjoying nothing at all. An exploiter is the politician who climbs to high offices in the state by taking advantage of the readiness of people to let themselves be duped, by flattering the conceits and vanities of the masses, by buying consciences and by using and abusing all the shortcomings and weaknesses of his fellow men. But exploited is the statesman who aims not at mere effect or applause but at the real advantage of the public and who is always ready to step down when he feels that he can no longer serve that advantage. An exploiter is the civil service employee who gets his position by cheating on examination and running crooked errands for some politician and who keeps it, does as little work as possible and gets promoted by fawning upon his superiors or betraying his oath as a public servant. Exploited, instead, is the man at the next desk who does just the opposite. An exploiter is the soldier who vanishes in the moment of danger but comes to life when the medals or citations are being handed out. Exploited is his comrade who faces death and injury without thought of posing as a hero or asking for a soft job and a pension for life. Exploiters are those peasants and, above all, those lazy, vicious and dishonest farmhands who begin by living on their more responsible relatives, continue sponging on their comrades, whom they ask for loans and repay in chatter and bad advice, and on their employers, whom they wheedle out of a day's pay for bad work or for no work at all, and who finally end in prison or the poorhouse as parasites on society at large. Exploited are those laborers who conscientiously and quietly do their duty, who never shirk discomfort and fatigue and who live hard lives, unable to better their lot or to lay anything aside for their old age. An exploiter is the man who deliberately shuns marriage and lays snares for the honor of other men's wives. Exploited is the man who takes on the burden and responsibilities of a legally constituted family and becomes the butt of the other's intrigue. An exploiter is the scholar who wins his chair by writing a book just to please the men who are to be his judges, or pursues fame by publishing a work that will flatter the popular passion of the moment. Exploited is the scholar who sacrifices a good part of his material success in life to love of truth, and resigns himself to living on a lower plane than the one to which his ability and learning would have lifted him had he been less devoted to the truth. Time was when the exploited were called the good, the honest, the courteous, the brave, the industrious and the temperate, and exploiters were called sinners, idlers, cowards, schemers, rascals and criminals. One may call them what one will. Perhaps it is not a bad idea to have just two expressions to synthesize the multiple categories that make up the two classes which have always existed and, alas, always will exist in the world. The important thing to remember is that although the exploited in the lower classes are more wretched, perhaps, and more to be pitied, there are a goodly number of exploited in the middle and higher classes. Otherwise there would be less of the spirit of self-sacrifice and sense of duty that are indispensable to the ruling minority if civilized living is to endure. There are writers who have tried to show by history that the upper classes, as arbiters of political power, have used their power constantly to exploit the working classes. Their hypothesis, and the manner in which they develop it, would lead one to suppose that human events had for centuries upon centuries been guided by a tenacious and constant will which knew whither it wanted to go and astutely shaped its means to that destination, that events, in other words, had been guided by one continuous and sinister conspiracy of the rich against the poor. Now all that seems to be a sort of persecution mania, to use very charitable terms. A calm and dispassionate observer sees at once in studying history that events that have social significance come about partly because of passions, instincts and prejudices, which are almost always unconscious and almost never consider their practical consequences, partly because of interests, which as a rule do have some definite and immediate objective, and in part, finally, because of what men call chance. Contrary to what some socialist writers seem to think, Christianity was not adopted because it was a religion that promised happiness in another life and guaranteed that the powerful could quietly enjoy their wealth in this life. Modern wars have never been waged in order to increase the public debt and hence the political influence of non-productive capital. America and Australia were not discovered in order to prepare an outlet for the teeming populations of Europe during the industrial age and so safeguard against excessive drops in wages. It is a matter of common knowledge that by altering just a few facts a very little and saying nothing about other facts, any case of persecution mania can be made to look like the profoundest sanity. That and no other is the method that is followed by socialist writers in order to prove that the ruling classes, who have made the laws and determined the policies of states, have used their political influence to pauperize the lower classes consciously and constantly. They generally cite laws and provisions that may be considered detrimental to those who live by manual labor, and when they are obliged to mention a law that is obviously favorable to them, they assert, without proof, of course, that it was wrested by the wage earners by force from the greed of capitalists and landowners. To mention a specific case, in Das Kapital, chapter 28, Marx declares that during the historical genesis of the capitalistic evolution, the rising bourgeoisie made use of the state in order to regulate wages, in other words, in order to keep them down to a level that was convenient for holding the worker in the desired degree of subjection. As proof of his statement, he mentions the Statute of Laborers of 1340, which fixes maximum wages, then other English statutes of the same sort from later periods, and finally a French ordinance of 1350. Now laws of that type are to be found in past centuries in other countries. Some were proclaimed in Germany at a time when the 30 Years' War had depopulated the country. They were always enacted when, either because of long wars or plagues, 1348, be it noted, was a year of the Black Death, populations had fallen off seriously and wages were rising sharply. But such provisions cannot be impartially evaluated unless they are compared with other contemporaneous, or almost contemporaneous, provisions that fixed maximum prices for bread, grain, cloth, house rent, and so on. Obviously, then, the rulers of the state could not have been thinking of systematically favoring the rise of the bourgeoisie. What they were thinking in their ignorance was that by passing the apposite laws they could either mitigate or prevent the serious economic disturbances that resulted from sudden and excessive rises in the prices of all sorts of commodities, including the prices of human labor. Laurier goes Marx one better. He says that there was a period when free lands were still abundant in Europe, and it was to the advantage of landowners that the proletariat should not save money and so acquire the capital necessary for cultivating them. Lie goes on to enumerate the methods that they used to obtain that end and to keep wages low. They were, he says, direct reductions in wages, depreciation of currency, introduction of machines that were more costly than the workers they replaced, expansion of non-productive capital invested in stock and banking manipulations, in metal currencies and in public debts, creation of excessive numbers of useless middlemen, stimulation of overpopulation in order to supply competition for employed workers. All these devices undoubtedly tend to limit production and so also to reduce profits. Nevertheless, the proprietor class does not hesitate to resort to them, because they are a necessary condition for assuring the continuation of profit by preventing rises in wages, which would inevitably mean the end of returns on capital. Now Laurier certainly never deserved the charge of being a sycophant of the capitalists, which Marx leveled at so many practitioners of economic science. It would have been useful, therefore, had he proved to us, 1. That in an epoch which cannot be very close to our own, since there were still free lands in Western Europe, the ruling class had such a competent knowledge of economic science that they were able to foresee that the measures mentioned, for instance, expansion in non-productive capital, would cause wages to fall. 2. That all those measures, among them depreciation of currency and overpopulation, could have been brought about by a voluntary decision on the part of those who held public power. While we are awaiting that proof, we permit ourselves to doubt whether even today governments or their friends have as much foresight as that, and, especially, whether they have the power to carry out all the economic manipulations that Laurier credits to their ancient predecessors. 7. It remains to consider whether the great current of ideas and emotions that can be designated as a whole by the term socialism may not at least have had the practical effect of improving the moral, and hence the material, conditions of the majority of people, even if it is not based upon an accurate observation of the laws that regulate social life, and even if it aims at an ideal that cannot be attained until human nature has radically altered. If it has had that effect, its influence could be called beneficial, and might be compared to the influence of other great collective illusions that have helped to strengthen the fabric of society by making men better, more tolerant of each other and less impatient with the injustices of the world, and by making life less harsh, within the limits of the possible, for those who are placed on the lower rungs of the economic ladder. The brief examination that we shall make on this important subject will, we serve notice in advance, yield a far from favorable verdict. Books have an intellectual influence which they exert through the doctrines that they contain, and which depends upon the manner in which certain problems of life are approached and presented. But they also have what one might call a moral influence, and that depends upon the passions and sentiments which, deliberately or unconsciously, writers whet or attenuate. If one sets out to examine the works of the greater sages of socialism from this moral point of view, especially the best-known socialist writers of the second half of the 19th century, one finds, indeed, that a spirit of peace, brotherly love, social harmony, breathes from the works, for example, of Rodbertus or of Carlo Mario. Particularly in Henry George one notes a noble and tender compassion for the weak that is more to the fore than hatred of the strong. Among Italian socialists who stress benevolent sentiments more than hatreds, one might mention Napoleone Cullahani and Ignazio Scarabelli. But books of another sort are far more numerous. To say nothing of Bakunin, in some of the most orthodox and most often republished writers, in Marx, for example, or Lassalle, the predominant sentiment is an aversion to the rich and the powerful that takes the form of unremitting irony, sarcasm and invective. In the Masters this attitude is presented, now with polemical gracefulness and vivacity, now with a dialectic that is ponderous and tiresome. But the word of the masters reaches the masses largely through newspapers and pamphlets, and in being popularized is usually garbled. In all this literature the capitalist is regarded and depicted as a man of virtually another race, another blood. The working man is not taught to look upon him as a fellow creature whose weaknesses and virtues are the same, fundamentally, as his own, but whose traits manifest themselves in somewhat different ways because his environment, temptations and life problems have been different. The working man is taught to regard the capitalist as a rival and an enemy, as a noxious creature, an oppressor, degraded and degrading, through whose ruin alone the redemption and salvation of the working classes can be effected. Now no movement that is as vast and complex as social democracy has become can be grounded solely upon the better instincts in human nature. It is both natural and necessary that the lower, the antisocial, the savage passions, quite as much as sentiments of justice and aspirations toward a better society, should find nourishment in such a movement. The trouble is that socialist doctrines offer the lower passions too vast and fertile a field in which to multiply and spread in a rank growth. The poor man is taught that the rich man leads a merry life upon the fruit of the poor man's toil, which is stolen by means of an artificial organization of society based on violence and fraud. That belief, in minds that are not absolutely noble and pure, serves admirably to justify a spirit of rebellion, a thirst for material pleasures, a hate that curses. It fosters a vengeful spirit and an instinctive envy of natural and social superiorities which only long habituation, and the realization that they are necessary and inevitable, can render universally undisputed and accepted. Nobili Vitaleski once wrote that the keyword to the riddle that is disturbing the sleep of Europe and the world is supplied in the distinction between wealth and happiness. Now an undeniable weakness in the whole socialist movement is its excessive materialization of the concept of human happiness and, therefore, of social justice. First, the socialists over-idealize the human being, representing him as better than he is and ascribing to the social order many or most of the vices and weaknesses that are inherent in human nature. But then they go on and express too low an opinion of their fellow men, when they believe, or pretend to believe, that wealth is the inseparable companion of pleasure, that poverty is inevitably one with suffering. To read socialist writings or listen to socialist sermons is to get the impression that individual happiness is exactly proportioned to the amount of money that one has in one's pocket. Such a system may be a useful tool of propaganda in the hands of innovators, in that it represents the injustice in present-day society as being much greater than it actually is. But it does not correspond to the facts. Luckily, things do not stand that way. There are, to be sure, types of poverty that seem inevitably to result in pain and unhappiness. Of that sort is the extreme poverty that does not admit of providing for the most elementary human needs. Then there is the envious poverty of the man who simply cannot resign himself to the fact that others have pleasures and satisfactions of vanity that he cannot hope ever to have. Finally, there is the poverty that comes with economic catastrophes and forces a lowering in the standards of living. Conversely, the pleasures and satisfactions that come when our economic and social status is improved are much less intense, and especially less abiding, than the pain that results from a proportionate falling off. It would seem, therefore, that the frequent changes in fortune which lift many up and cast many down yield a net total in which suffering figures far more largely than happiness. There is no denying that a man's ability to maintain the standard of living to which he has been accustomed, and especially a sense of security for the morrow, are conditions that are indispensable to a certain well-being. But it is no less true that many other elements, objective and subjective, figure in individual happiness. The man who has a kindly disposition and a well-balanced temperament may be far more nearly satisfied with life than another man who has more wealth than he, and a better social position. The very fact that the world generally recognizes that the former has been inadequately rewarded may, along with the inner approval that he gets from his own conscience, contribute not a little to his greater felicity. Other doctrines, other beliefs, have found themselves confronted with the grave and tormenting problem of life, in which the just and the good often succumb while the unjust and the wicked triumph. But the solutions they have found have been different from the solutions that socialism proposes. The Stoics realized that they could not banish unhappiness from the world. They therefore taught their disciples to endure it bravely. Unable to promise everyone the enjoyment of material pleasures, they urged even those who were in a position to enjoy them lavishly to scorn them. The same scorn of material pleasures and of the joys of the flesh we find in Christianity in its early days, and in all its moments of fanaticism. Exaggeration of that tendency may lead to a sort of mysticism, which sometimes alienates noble characters, souls that are predisposed to self-sacrifice, from the world and from life. Such teachings are not only morally higher, they are also more practical than the diametrically opposite teachings of socialists in general. These latter are likely to result in a lowering, momentary at least, of some of the noblest sentiments in human nature. Socialists are not the first to have preached equality and to have aspired to absolute justice in the world. But equality and absolute justice can be preached by urging toleration, mutual indulgence, brotherly love, and they can be preached by appealing to hatred and violence. One may bid the rich and the powerful to look upon the poor and unhappy as their brothers, and the poor and unhappy can be made to believe that the rich and powerful are their enemies. The first line was followed by Jesus, the apostles, and Saint Francis of Assisi, who said to the rich, "Give." The second is followed by the majority of present-day socialists, who describe the pleasures of the rich as the product of the sweat of the poor man's brow and implicitly or explicitly say, "Take." Such substantial differences in method can only lead to significant differences in practical results. 8. It will not be necessary to linger very long on the causes of the socialist current. The cause of those causes is the thing that we have been trying to combat in the whole course of this work, the intellectual attitude of our times toward doctrines that concern the organization of society, the ideas that now prevail in persons of average and sometimes of higher education as to the laws that regulate political relations. Naturally, this basic cause presents itself in 1,000 forms and generates many other multifarious causes, now secondary, now direct. There is a very close connection between the moral and intellectual worlds in everything that pertains to social organization. A mistaken direction in the speculative field, therefore, a mistaken appraisal of human nature and of social tendencies in men, has the effect, in the field of practice, of placing men in false positions and so of making them more prone to compromises and wrongdoing. As a result, the influence of the nobler instincts is weakened and necessarily, therefore, average levels of character and conscience are lowered. An important factor in the progress of socialist propaganda, and one of its most direct and immediate causes, has been the broadening of suffrage, or, more exactly, universal suffrage, which has come to be more and more widely adopted in Europe in deference to the principles of the radical school and to democratic logic. Now the danger in broad-based suffrage is not so much that if proletarians get the right to drop their ballots into a box their genuine representatives may come to be in the majority in our political assemblies, as many fear or hope. After all, whatever the election system, control will always remain with the more influential classes, rather than with the more numerous classes. The danger lies rather in the fact that in order to gain an advantage over their rivals most candidates do all they can to pamper popular sentiments and prejudices. That attitude leads to promises and professions of faith that are based on the postulates of socialism. The natural result of the system is that the more honest and energetic people are alienated from public life, compromises and moral reservations become more and more the rule, while the ranks of the so-called conservatives become more and more stultified, both intellectually and morally. Another important element in the growth of socialist parties is the revolutionary tradition that is still very vigorous in Latin countries. There the ruling classes have done their utmost to keep it alive and to perpetuate it. As Viltar has observed, and as we noted above, Chapter 8, Section 6, in France, down to a few years ago at least, only interests were conservative. Ideas and sentiments, as inspired by private education and training, and even more by public education and propaganda, were eminently revolutionary. The same thing may be said of Italy during the 50 years preceding the World War. It is natural for young people to feel a need of enthusiasms, of having before them a type, a model, that represents an ideal of virtue and perfection which each one seeks, as far as he can, to imitate. The model that has been set before the eyes of young people in France, and in other countries, has not been, as it could not have been, the knight who dies for his lady, his faith and his king. Much less has it been the public servant, the magistrate, the soldier, the uncompromising custodian of law and order. It has been the militant revolutionist pure and simple. It has been the champion of liberty and equality, the man who has fought tyrants and rebelled against constituted powers, who in defeat has endured their persecution intrepidly and in victory has overthrown and often supplanted them. In view of the fact that sympathy for rebels has been so assiduously cultivated, and that our school children have been taught that everything that rebels have done has been noble and generous, it is natural that currents of sentiments and ideas in each new generation should incline toward doctrines that justify rebellion and teach its necessity. No Bastilles are left to storm. No Swiss guards of a Charles X are left to be chased from the Louvre. Italian, Greek, Polish unities are all but achieved. The Neapolitan government that was defined as the negation of God is a memory so remote that people are even beginning to judge it impartially. In a world so free of monsters, the spirit of rebellion can only turn upon institutions that have survived old revolution, or upon the men who stand at the head of them and have often been old revolutionaries themselves. This is all the more natural in that, partly because of the imperfections that are inseparable from any political system, partly because of their intrinsic weakness, our modern institutions have not been able to satisfy all the expectations and hopes of social regeneration that were reposed in them at the beginning. Furthermore, once the sometime conspirators and revolutionaries became statesmen and leaders of peoples, not all of them proved at all times to be free of errors and shortcomings. Under such circumstances, who can marvel that there are younger elements who think that a still more radical reform of society is possible? And who can marvel that those who hope to acquire political importance through radical reform, that a goodly portion of the noble, the active, the generous, the ambitious, in the generations now making ready to take the torch from the hands of the old, have embraced socialist doctrines? The psychological state that we have just described used to be very characteristic of the young men in European universities. It is admirably portrayed in a little book that Guglielmo Ferrero published some years ago. After explaining why men of the younger generation did not believe in the ideals of their fathers and found no inspiration in them, Ferrero continues. There are always a certain number of individuals who need to become aroused over something that is not immediate and personal to them, something that is afar off. Their own affairs, the problems of science or of art, are not enough to take up all their spiritual activity. What is left for them except the socialist idea? It comes from far away, a trait that is always alluring. It is complex enough and vague enough, at least in certain of its aspects, to satisfy the widely differing moral needs of its many proselytes. On the one hand, it brings a broad spirit of brotherhood and international feeling, which corresponds to a real modern need. On the other, it has a suggestion of scientific method that is reassuring to minds that are more or less familiar with the experimental schools. Given all that, it is no wonder that a great number of young men throw in their lot with a movement in which there may indeed be a danger of meeting some unpretentious ex-convict, or some potential second offender, but in which one will be sure never to meet a professional politician, a professional patriot, a professional grafter. Ferrero goes on to argue that economic conditions in Italy were not such as to explain the rise of a powerful socialist movement, and that, at any rate, such a movement ought logically to find its nucleus in the working classes, not in the bourgeoisie. Then he concludes. If a socialist movement has developed under such unfavorable conditions and in so illogical a fashion, it must be because more than any other movement, it answers a moral need in a certain number of young people. One of the maxims of Machiavelli has acquired a certain popularity among persons of erudition. The secretary wrote that one of the best ways to save or revive an aging institution was to call it back to its first principles. In reading a history of the Mongol princes who descended from Genghis Khan, we come across another maxim that seems to run in a diametrically opposite direction to the maxim of Machiavelli, and it strikes us as being truer, since it fits in with a greater number of practical cases. According to the story, Yeliwi Kutsai, prime minister to Ogdai, son of Genghis Khan, often said to his lord and master, "Your empire was conquered on horseback, but you cannot rule it from the back of a horse." No one, surely, will venture to deny the political insight of the Mongol minister, for the methods by which governments, religions or political parties are kept alive, and the sentiments and passions that have to be cultivated if they are to be kept alive, are often essentially different from the means and sentiments that have served to bring them into being. One readily sees that a new government, a new political system, may be instituted by revolution, and one may further grant that revolutions may often be necessary. But no state can grow in strength, no system can endure, if the revolutionary atmosphere continues, and if, worse still, those who are in control of power persist in fomenting revolution instead of cultivating the sentiments, passions and ideas that are directly opposed to it. Other causes have contributed to the progress of socialism, among them the sudden fortunes that are won by many speculators, almost always dishonestly, and which are just as badly spent in purchasing improper political influence to be used in more gains or in a vulgar and showy display of luxury that offends the modest respectability of the average citizen and actually insults the poverty of the poor. The whole drift of the age is in the direction of aggravating that evil. Though equality and equal rights for all are the topics of our sermons, there has perhaps never been a time when inequalities in material advantages were so visible to the eye. Never has wealth, whatever its sources, served to open more doors, and never has it been so stupidly flaunted. In earlier centuries, luxury and display had a, so to say, primitive something about them. One kept a large retinue of servants. One offered lavish hospitality. Sometimes one distributed food and drink to the population of a whole city. Vanity played its part, beyond any doubt, in all such devices for disposing of one's surplus, but, as things turned out, a portion of the superfluous was enjoyed by those who needed it most. In more refined epochs the bounty of the great went into patronage of artists and poets, who were encouraged and enabled to create masterpieces of art and literature that yielded exquisite intellectual pleasure not only to the owner or patron but to all who were capable of appreciating them. Modern luxury is often more selfish and less intellectual. It comes down primarily to organizing an enormous array of comforts and sensual satisfactions for those who can spend the money. Not only that, the private pleasures which it procures for the few are industriously publicized by the daily press. That again, after all, is nothing but an expression of human vanity, but the practical effect of all this modern publicity is to make pleasures which only the rich can enjoy seem greater than they really are, and so to increase the envy and appetite of those who are deprived of them. Other factors in the growth of socialism have been stressed by many: the ill-advised warfare that has been waged on religious sentiment, the public poverty that is produced by excessive taxes, excessive public debts and too many unproductive public expenditures, the notorious dishonesty of men in power, the injustices and hypocrisies of parliamentary systems, the present arrangements in secondary and higher education that have turned the schools into factories of misfits. A leading position on this list must be reserved for the custom of using influence upon public opinion and governments to win monopolistic concessions or protective tariffs in industry and agriculture. Such things are a form of socialism, in a sense, and so it follows that any other form of socialism is justified, since a really worse one is already in vogue, in that it uses the authority of the state to serve the benefit of a few who are the richest and the detriment of all others, both poor and rich. Neglect of the rules of hygiene, lack of good food, good water and sanitary housing, do not generate the cholera bacillus. They do weaken the human organism and lower its resistance to disease, and so help to propagate the plague once it has taken hold. In the same way, all the various factors that we have enumerated, all these various manifestations of bad public management, are not directly responsible for the intellectual germs that have caused the morbus called socialism. They have increased discontent and lowered the organic resistance of society, and so have furthered its spread. It is therefore in point to urge a stricter social hygiene upon the ruling classes, which implies their dropping old errors. Unfortunately, such advice is easy to give but hard to follow. Before it could be taken and put into practice, the ruling classes would have to develop a greater morality, a greater farsightedness and more talent than they have been displaying in many countries of the Western world. 9. Few among those who follow the movement of public life in Europe and America today fail to ask themselves sooner or later whether social democracy is or is not destined to triumph in a more or less imminent future. Many people who have no sympathy with socialist doctrines and no interest in favoring them are nevertheless inclined to answer the question in the affirmative. That is one of the results of an intellectual training that has brought a great majority of educated persons in our time to look upon the history of humanity as one continuous journey toward the realization of ideas that are now commonly called advanced. As for collectivists and anarchists themselves, blind confidence in the fated, inevitable, and more or less imminent triumph of their program is the common rule, and it is a great source of strength to them, serving them much as the early Christians were served by their faith in an early advent of the kingdom of God or in the future life. The primitive Christians, again, faced martyrdom intrepidly, firm in their trust in divine revelation. So the radicals of today gladly suffer annoyances, discomforts and persecutions, when by chance they are called upon to suffer a few, savoring in foretaste the joys of a certain victory that many believe to be near at hand. Many of the more enthusiastic socialist writers of the early days placed the date for the triumph of collectivism at the end of the 19th century, or in the early decades of the 20th. In view of all that we have been saying, no one will be surprised if we assert that, even granting that collectivists and anarchists may chance to be victorious and gain control of political authority in a number of countries, the carrying out of their program would continue to be impossible, for the postulates of collectivism, communism and anarchy never can be put into practice, any more than the ideals of the early Christians could be put into practice after the official triumph of Christianity. But it still remains to be seen just what probability there is of a triumph for social democracy. For suppose a mere attempt were made, and sustained over a number of years, to put the collectivist theories into force. Even if it did not alter the constant laws that regulate the organization of human societies, which would inevitably assert themselves in the end and triumph, it would weigh grievously on the lot of the generations on which the experiment would be made. Torn between revolution and the inevitable reactions to revolution, those generations would at the best be forced to return to a much cruder and more absolute type of government than any that we now know. There would necessarily be a deterioration in juridical defense and a real moral and material cataclysm. Centuries later such a cataclysm might be studied with interest, and perhaps even with amusement, as an unusually instructive case of social pathology, but meantime it would entail unspeakable agonies for those who would be called upon to witness it and to be its victims. But, even when stated in those terms, The question is not one that can be answered with certainty, for many arguments can be adduced for and against the temporary triumph of the social revolution. The elements on which a prognosis has to be based vary from one European country to another, and the problem becomes still more complicated if we extend our preview to the English colonies and the United States. Certainly it would be much harder to make a mere attempt to establish collectivism than it would be to overthrow the staunchest of the governments now existing. Under the present organization of society, the two reins that any government uses in leading a nation are the bureaucracy and the standing army. As we have already seen, Chapter 8, Section 6, and all earlier revolutions, the Great French Revolution excepted, the rider has often changed but the reins have never broken, they have continued functioning almost normally. But if a great social revolution were to triumph, it is doubtful whether the present body of civil employees and officials could continue to function, and it is exceedingly doubtful whether the victors would find the personnel to supplant them in their own rank and file. The normal organs of government having ceased to operate, a period of anarchy would follow, of which no one could say what the outcome would be, except that it would be such an outcome that even a temporary continuation of the effort to establish collectivism would be impossible. The present organization of society has immense powers of resistance. Just how strong they are has never, so far, been tested. The destinies of an incalculable number of people and interests are bound up with continuing the system now prevailing: bankers, merchants, manufacturers, public and private employees, holders of government bonds, savings bank depositors, property owners great and small. Such people would make up a great army. In its ranks would be many who sympathize with ideas of social equality when it is a question of something vague and far away, but who would certainly feel otherwise once they saw the execution of those principles near at hand and a threat to their personal interests imminent. The growth within postal, telegraph and transportation departments of unions of employees that are hostile to the state might render the effect of such agencies much less dependable, but we must figure that a government might at certain moments find itself in complete control of them, and they would be very effective instruments of action. The government also could use the millions of treasure that would be lying in the public vaults, to say nothing of the millions that the banks could readily supply, or of unlimited amounts of fiat currency that could be issued. The state, finally, has the police force at its disposal, and the standing army. Proposals have been made of late to transform the army into the so-called nation in arms, with recruiting by localities in time of peace, very short terms of training service, and so on. But unless the army has been disorganized by such concessions to the democratic spirit, if it is sound, in other words, and is resolutely used, it can deal successfully with any attempt at armed insurrection. The fact that armies might be reduced to relatively small numbers would not alter that situation. On the other hand, account must be taken of the continuous propaganda that social democracy is carrying on in all social classes, even in groups that should be most inclined to defend the present order. This propaganda rarely makes full and thoroughgoing conversions among people of a certain age and a certain social position, but it does make many people, who ought to fight the new revolutionary current as a matter of interest or duty, doubt the justice of their own case, and in the moment of danger it might cause a large part of the forces that are appointed to arrest it to waver. Such a faltering might contribute seriously toward defeat when taken in conjunction with the slow disorganizing influence that parliamentarism is exerting upon all the organs of state. How expect steadiness in danger, or scrupulous and loyal service, from a bureaucratic machine that has grown used to the shifting policies of successive ministries, from prefects and police officials who turn every so often into vote rustlers? What confidence can one have in men who are virtually obliged by the positions they hold not to feel any loyalty or sincere devotion to any principle or to any person, who are called upon today to fight the man whose orders they were taking yesterday, whose main concern has to be to avoid becoming embroiled with the master of today, but in such a way as not to make too great an enemy of the master of tomorrow? That is the way to train good tightrope walkers, and such people do very well for the routine moments of administrative life. But they possess neither the habit of blind obedience nor the courage to take the initiative boldly and assume grave responsibilities. Steadiness of brain and heart is rare enough in men who are accustomed to compromises and expedients, but the quality is most essential in high officials of a government at the extraordinary moments when revolutions come. Our bureaucrats will surely be found lacking in it. What more than anything else makes any sort of prediction difficult is the fact that the day when the revolutionary outbreak occurs, and in our opinion it is by no means certain to come, will not be fixed by the men who are or will be holding power in the various countries, nor even by the leaders of social democracy. It will be fixed by unforeseeable events, either involuntary mistakes on the part of governments or happenings that will profoundly shock society and throw it into spectacular ferment, but which no one will deliberately have provoked and no one will be able to prevent. Events that might provoke a social revolution would be, for instance, a disaster in a war with some foreign power, A grave industrial and agricultural crisis or financial bankruptcy on the part of one or more great European powers. But there is no certainty that the occasion that will force the Revolutionary Party to act will be the best imaginable for it. There is no telling whether, at that moment, its forces will be in the best possible shape and the forces of its adversaries sufficiently disorganized. However, the longer the favorable moment for starting the revolution is delayed in coming, the less favorable it will be for the revolutionaries. It is difficult to keep up any sort of agitation in the masses for very long when nothing concrete is being done to enable them to second a probability of realizing the ideals propounded by the agitation. In France and a few other countries, the habits and traditions of armed social conflict have been preserved and are still strong. But if any great length of time were still to elapse, they would be weakened, and there would be a complete lack of leaders of the necessary experience and prestige in a position to direct the course of a revolution. 10. In any case, suppose we grant that a violent movement is avoided. Suppose we grant even that the so-called evolutionary wing succeeds in maintaining such a preponderance in the ranks of the radicals that it can prevent an armed outbreak for the present, or for generations to come. Even so, social democracy will not cease to be a violent disintegrating agency in modern society, and if the new doctrine has not subdued the order of things now prevailing, will always remain in a state of instability and have to be upheld to a great extent by sheer physical force. Now physical force may suffice to prevent the outbreak of a violent catastrophe from day to day, but it cannot restore to the social body the moral unity essential for a stable order. As we have already seen, Chapter 7, Section 10, brute force, taken all by itself, cannot suppress or even restrain a current of ideas and passions unless it is applied without scruple and without consideration, unless, that is, it is applied with a cruelty that does not falter at the number of its victims. Aside from the fact that such a use of force is undesirable, it is impossible in our day and age, our manners and morals being what they are, unless at least it is provoked by similar outrages on the part of the revolutionaries. If European civilization is forced to keep long and incessantly on the defensive against the tendencies of the various socialist schools, it will be forced by that very fact into a decline, and the decline will come whether our civilization tries to compromise, make concessions and come to terms, or adopts a policy of absolute coercion and resistance. In order to maintain the latter, it will have to abandon most of its idealism, restrict liberty of thought and adopt new types of government which will represent a real retrogression in the safeguarding of justice and in judicial defense. Many remedies have been suggested, and certainly many among them are not to be rejected. They may increase the patient's powers of resistance, even if the best of them will not remove the cause of the malady. If national economic systems are improved, if taxes are lowered, if justice is made more equitable and effective, if all abuses that can be done away with are done away with, that certainly will be of no mean benefit to society. But social democracy aspires to absolute justice, to absolute equality, and these can never be attained. Social democracy, therefore, will certainly not disarm in consideration of such benefits. It will not pardon bourgeois society merely because bourgeois society confesses to some of its sins and does penance. Unlike the God of the Christians, the real socialist, so far as the present economic order is concerned, wants the death of the sinner. He does not want him to reform and live. There is a second type of remedy on which statesmen, and some few modern sovereigns, have pinned great hopes. It consists in applying the principle of state control to curing or reducing many of the injustices or sufferings that result from economic individualism and from the merciless competition in which property owners, manufacturers and the captains of big industry are engaged, both of which cause misery and uncertainty of the morrow for the wage-earning proletariat. We have already expressed our opinion on this point, Chapter 6, Sections 3-4, above. There we said that there is not a social question, but many social questions, and that the principle of control by the state, in other words, by the bureaucracy and other organized directing groups, is to be justified or rejected case by case. Certainly there are examples where state control, used in moderation, may be welcome, as in the regulation of working hours and types of work for women and children. There is no denying, either, that as regards charities, public assistance and mutual aid, our social organization today is inadequate. We have no organizations intermediate between the state and the large municipality, which in Europe is an instrument of the state. Such units are too large. Within them the individual disappears and is forgotten. On the other hand, there is nothing intermediate between the municipality and the modern family, which has come to be reduced to the utmost simplicity, to the lowest possible terms. Even brothers and sisters nowadays often feel no responsibility for each other. There were such intermediate organizations in the old days in Europe, and there still are in other civilizations. In India, for instance, in every town or village, members of the same caste, or rather of the same subdivision in the caste, assist each other. Mutual aid is customary in Mohammedan countries among members of the same tribe. In China, the family is a much more comprehensive thing than in Europe. Descendants of the same ancestor down to the third generation ordinarily live together and are conscious of a community of interests. In Japan, the inhabitants of the same village, or of the same quarter in a city, consider themselves obliged as a matter of course to succor a neighbor who has come upon misfortune. If his house burns down, for instance, they build him another at their common expense. In antiquity, in the Middle Ages and down to a century ago, the corporations and brotherhoods of the trades and professions performed just those functions in Italy. Such institutions impose certain obligations on their members, but they also recognize that the members have certain rights. Their main advantage is that they keep the individual, or the family, that is smitten by temporary misfortune from being left in the lurch and driven to despair. Beyond any doubt, something has to be done on that score, and perhaps it would be just as well if governments were to keep hands off, so that natural solidarities might grow up again of their own accord. The main requirement would be a long period of stability in population and in economic interests. In Western Europe, especially in large towns, the family from which assistance can be expected comes down practically to the father, the mother and minor children. If through some misfortune the head of the family who is working for a living chances to lose his wages for some months' time, he is certain to face poverty and despair. Now what is called individualism in Europe, the principle and the fact of each man for himself and God for all, has come about virtually in our time, partly because of the frequent changes of fortune that break or strain bonds of family, neighborhood or professional association, partly because of large-scale movements in population that have been due to the growth of new industrial centers, especially new cities. Great cities are inhabited in large part by floating populations. A family rarely lives in the same house for 10 years in succession, and a person scarcely ever knows his next-door neighbor. Under such circumstances the most painful cases of destitution occur. Living alone in the midst of a great throng, an individual or a family can literally starve. But what is ordinarily expected of state control is something far more than mere relief of distress. Many people want the state to influence the distribution of wealth directly. They want it to deprive the rich of their surplus through taxation and give it to the poor. This idea is being viewed with considerable sympathy even among conservatives. It is the sort of thing that appeals to our numerous socialistoids, or pinks, as they are often called, that large body of people who do not join any collectivist or anarchist party but create the sympathetic environment in which such parties flourish and prosper. Now the proposal in question is a truly dangerous one. Any very wide application of it, such as striking at capital too severely, or trying, for example, to specify the crops that shall be raised on certain lands, would kill the goose that lays the golden egg. It would cause a serious falling off in the production of wealth and increase misery and discontent at all social levels. Such a system would not give us collectivism. Social inequalities would not disappear, and radicals would still have something substantial to ask for. But the whole economy of so-called bourgeois society would be seriously disturbed and its functioning would be thoroughly disorganized. That the followers of Marx should favor the temporary application of the system is natural and logical enough. It would be one of those best calculated to reduce society to a level where an experiment in collectivism would become desirable. But it does seem strange that people who do not accept collectivist theories should hope to combat and neutralize them with a policy that would make the economic situation of everybody worse, and reduce almost everybody to looking upon collectivism as an improvement. There are other measures which many people favor, regarding them as very proper concessions to socialist demands. Of these we might mention the right to work, in other words an obligation on the part of the state to pay salaries to all the unemployed, the compulsory breaking up of great landed properties, which would be tantamount to forcing the introduction of small-scale agriculture by law, even in regions where natural conditions are not congenial to its existence, a maximum 8-hour working day, established not by the mutual consent of workers and employers but by statute, a minimum wage scale, also established by law, a single and heavily progressive income tax. Anyone who has even a moderate knowledge of the working of economic laws can see at a glance that the application of such provisions would destroy private capital in the course of a few years. At the same time, it must be confessed, the governments of not a few European countries have gone so far in certain directions that they can hardly reject these demands of socialists and near-socialists, and other proposals of the same sort, without doing grievous violence to logic and equity. If the price of bread is going to be raised artificially on the specious pretext that landowners must be guaranteed a fair profit on wheat, how can the working man be refused a fair minimum price for his labor? Christian socialism, and Catholic socialism in particular, are regarded by many people as tools that are well adapted to neutralizing atheistic, materialistic and revolutionary socialism. Well-intentioned efforts have been made, and are still being made, in these Christian directions, and they have not been altogether ineffective. However, we should not have unlimited faith in a flank counterattack. It is true, as we have already seen, that both Christianity and socialism take advantage of the hunger for justice and the ideal that is common to all human beings, who are nevertheless obliged to live in a world where there are many, many iniquities for which they are themselves responsible. But both Christianity and socialism depend upon other sentiments besides the hunger for justice, and such sentiments are by no means identical in the two doctrines. Their methods of propaganda and their aspirations are also essentially different, and very, very different are the intellectual settings which they require for their growth and prosperity. The basis of Christianity is faith in the supernatural, in a God who sees the tears of the poor and sorrowful, consoles them in this life and rewards them in the life to come. Socialism originates in the rationalist philosophy of the 18th century. It takes its stand on materialistic doctrines, which teach that all happiness lies in the satisfaction of earthly instincts and passions. Christianity and socialism are therefore two plants of a very different nature. They may well vie with each other for the sap in the ground, but they cannot possibly be grafted on each other. Vain, therefore, is the hope that a Christian shoot inserted into a socialist trunk will ever change the fruit, eliminating all its bitter flavor, its ever harmful quality, and leaving it sweet and wholesome. Christian socialism is nothing else, and can be nothing else, than a new name applied to an old thing, in other words, Christian charity. Christian charity, doubtless, is able to render great services to European society, but it could not wholly destroy atheistic and revolutionary socialism unless the world were again to be as thoroughly steeped in the Christian spirit as it was in the less tutored centuries of the Middle Ages. 11. Under the conditions that at present prevail in European civilization, the one remedy that can strike the evil at the root, cut off the supply of vital sap on which the grown tree flourishes and cause it to wither away, is of a very different order. Social democracy is more than anything else the intellectual malady of our age. To be sure, it found a propitious moral environment. It found a soil prepared by all the rancors, ambitions and greeds that necessarily resulted from a long revolutionary period and from the shiftings of fortunes that were bound up with such a period. Supremely beneficial to it has been the world's disappointment with parliamentary democracy, which set out to inaugurate a reign of justice and equality in the world, and has failed miserably to keep that promise. Nevertheless, this new doctrine originates in a system of ideas which is nothing, after all, but the logical consequence of the system in which the pure democracy of the old days found its inspiration. Belief in the possibility that government can emanate from the majority, faith in the incorruptibility of the majority, confidence that once they have been emancipated from every principle of authority that is not rooted in universal consensus, from every aristocratic, monarchical and religious superstition, men will be able to inaugurate the political system that will best serve the general interests and the interests of justice, such as the content of the body of ideas and sentiments that has combated, and is combating, Christian beliefs in the people, and is the chief obstacle to any compromise with the Church. Ideas and sentiments of the same sort have produced parliamentary democracy and, as we have seen, are now preventing the application of radical remedies to parliamentarism. The same body of ideas and sentiments, finally, is sweeping us inexorably toward socialism, and ultimately toward anarchy. There is no stopping along the road. Once experience has shown that mere political equality as embodied in universal suffrage fails to produce political equality in the fact and maintains the political preeminence of a given class and of certain social influences, it is natural and logical that a system should be contrived which will destroy disparities in private fortunes and place all who aspire to rule over society, and therefore need the votes of the people, on an equal footing. And after a somewhat riper experience has made it clear, or made it merely plausible, that not even in that way can one get a government that is a genuine emanation of the majority will, much less absolute justice, we will have, as the final implication of a metaphysical concept that has vainly sought to concretize itself, a doctrine that favors ending any sort of social organization whatever, and therefore, anarchy. Now democratic doctrine has rendered undeniable services to civilization. Embodied in the representative system, for which England set the pattern, it has contributed to important improvements in juridical defense, which have been attained through a system of free discussion that has been established in many parts of Europe. But now that we have come to its last logical implication, and men are trying to realize the principles on which it was based down to their remotest consequences, the same doctrine is disorganizing the countries in which it prevails and forcing them into their decline. This would not be the first case where a society has retrogressed from trying to carry to their logical conclusions principles, doctrines and methods which at the start contributed to its greatness. In the early days of the Roman Empire, strong bureaucratic organization was a great source of progress, and thanks to it the empire was able to assimilate a large part of the world. Later on, excessive bureaucratization became one of the main factors in the decline of the empire. Fanaticism and blind, exclusive faith in the Quran were the most important factors in the rapid spread of Mohammedan civilization. As centuries went by, they became the chief reason for the fossilization and decadence of the Mohammedan world. Things could not be otherwise with democracy because, at bottom, under pseudoscientific appearances, the democratic doctrine is altogether a prioristic. Its premises are not in the slightest degree justified by the facts. Absolute equality has never existed in human societies. Political power never has been, and never will be, founded upon the explicit consent of majorities. It always has been, and it always will be, exercised by organized minorities, which have had, and will have, the means, varying as the times vary, to impose their supremacy on the multitudes. Only a wise organization of society and a truly unprecedented number of favoring historical circumstances have managed to render the preeminence of a ruling class less burdensome and less abusive in our time. Renan wrote that the Roman Empire could have arrested the spread of Christianity on one condition only, if it had consented to a positive teaching of the natural sciences. Scientific knowledge was the only thing that could, by showing that natural happenings in our world obey unchanging laws, develop a sense of reality and succeed in eradicating from the human spirit the belief in miracles and in the continuous intervention of the supernatural. But at that time the natural sciences had barely reached their embryonic stage, and Christianity triumphed. In the world in which we are living, socialism will be arrested only if a realistic political science succeeds in demolishing the metaphysical and optimistic methods that prevail at present in social studies, in other words, only if discovery and demonstration of the great constant laws that manifest themselves in all human societies succeed in making visible to the eye the impossibility of realizing the democratic ideal. On this condition, and on this condition only, will the intellectual classes escape the influence of social democracy and form an invincible barrier to its triumph. So far students of the social sciences, and more especially economists, have examined this or that postulate of socialism from the standpoint of showing its patent fallacy. That is not enough. It is something like showing that one miracle or another is false, without destroying faith in the possibility of miracles. A whole metaphysical system must be met with a whole scientific system. In higher education, a distinguished scientist writes, the theories of scientific economics and sociology must be set up in opposition to the errors of Marxism, so that youthful minds will not be left prey to chimerical fancies that are set before them as the latest results of science. Wise, sound words. But they merely express a praiseworthy desire. They do not point to a remedy of swift and certain efficacy. The study of economics is an excellent thing, but it is not in itself sufficient to cleanse the public mind of the chimerical fancies alluded to. Economic science has penetratingly investigated the laws that regulate the production and distribution of wealth. It has as yet done little with the relations of those laws to other laws that operate in the political organization of human societies. Economists have not concerned themselves with those beliefs, those collective illusions, which sometimes become general in given societies, and which form so large a part of the history of the world. As has been well said, man does not live by bread alone. As for sociology, we are inclined to think that, in the majority of its doctrines at least, it has so far not shown itself to be a mature science producing results that cannot be questioned. In the second half of the 19th century the democratic socialist metaphysic had to compete only with systems that styled themselves as positive but were just as metaphysical as it was, finding even less support in the actual lives that nations have lived and being even less susceptible of practical application. As between a number of different metaphysical systems it is natural that predominance should have rested with the system that best humored the keenest and most universal passions. Arduous, therefore, is the task which is set for political science, and it will be all the more arduous in that the truths which it will be its mission to reveal will not be generally popular, since they will shock many passions and cross many interests. It is highly probable, then, that in spite of the traditions of free discussion that distinguish our age, the propagation of these new scientific results will once more encounter the obstacles that have retarded progress in other branches of learning. There is little likelihood that the new doctrines will find much support in our governments, or in our ruling classes, which nevertheless ought to support them. Interests, whatever their nature, love propaganda, not impartial discussion. They support only the theory that serves the particular and immediate purpose, that justifies the man, that sustains the given administration or party. They have no use for the theory that can yield practical results only in the general interests of society and in a future relatively remote. If science triumphs in the end, its victory will be then as always due to the conscientiousness of honest scholars, whose duty it is, above every consideration, to seek and expound the truth.